To think about Black identity in the archaeological way, right? Let's talk about that really quickly. We can think of Black identity in terms of a specific form of life, which binds a group of individuals to one another, a sort of collective true self, right? This form of life is distinct from other people's, perhaps different in its conception of knowledge, right, in its understanding of beauty, as well as in its formulation of the moral and ethical norms that ought to guide action in the world. On this view, Black identity reflects the common historical experiences and shared vocabularies which provide us as one people with stable, unchanging, and continuous frames of reference and meaning beneath the shifting divisions and vicissitudes of our actual history. This singularity or oneness is the essence of the people and constitutive of who we are as individuals. Now, the political theorist and now president of the University of Pennsylvania, Amy Gutmann, describes this view as that of a cultural identity group, right? On this view, culture represents a way of life that is comprehensive in that it constitutes and constrains the identities and therefore the lives of its members by providing them with a common language, history, institutions of socialization, range of occupations, history and lifestyles, distinctive literary and artistic traditions, architectural styles, music, dress, and whatnot. Gutmann does not include African Americans in this category. She reserves the majority of her description of us for a chapter on processes of ascription. I suspect Black folk are not considered examples of a cultural group for her because they do not, or we do not, occupy a distinctive territory. But part of the interesting challenge of Black identity talk is that it is complexly articulated. It may involve a racial dimension, a cultural or political dimension, depending on the ends to which it is invoked. When articulated, for example, as a particular form of Black nationalist politics, Black identity talk is much like the cultural identity group Gutmann talks about. The Black nation provides the boundaries within which we think of our political ambitions, right? Territorial or cultural sovereignty, for example. Y'all all right? Okay, you following me? Well, if not, I'll bring it home, right? Who we are and how we understand our relation to others, and perhaps most important, how we understand our obligations to one another. Here, on this Black nation thesis, here the notions of good and obligation proceed out of our understanding of the racial self. In other words, Black identities and the culture out of which they take shape provide a comprehensive context out of which its members make choices. I want to focus this by reference to a historical example really quickly. Cultural nationalists of various sorts in the era of Black power, right, argued that there is a specific cultural inheritance for African Americans. We are African, they argued, right? We have a value system that, in spite of the perceived rupture of the transatlantic slave trade, continues to distinguish us from Europeans and animate our present-day choices. I mean, Kwanzaa, for example, is an outgrowth of this particular position, right? Those of you who celebrate Kwanzaa didn't know you were all Black nationalists, did you, right? If these values, in fact, fail, at least consciously, to inform our actions, such a state of affairs only indicates the effects of white supremacy. We simply, on this view, have been robbed of our cultural inheritance. In light of this, our aim should be to reconstruct as best as possible a form of life that reflects the true way of being African in the world. So Maulana Karenga, the founder of the US organization, developed an elaborate cultural theory of Blackness, what he called Kawaida theory, designed to reorient African people in the United States. Through a complex set of ritual practices, i.e. Kwanzaa, Karenga argued that African Americans could reconnect with their past, with the proper way of being African in the world, and this reconnection would then facilitate a healthier relationship with others and a more revolutionary politics. Karenga's view was only one expression of a general position which informed most of the various political projects of the period. Many believed that African American freedom required a revolution of Black minds, right? Black individuals needed to remove the psychological chains of white supremacy and embrace a Black national consciousness which reflected a more authentic way of being in the world. A world, as Karenga was fond of saying, in which Blackness would become our ultimate reality. Blackness would become our ultimate reality. This position assumed what can be called an expressivist conception of the racial self. For Karenga and many others, African Americans were self-determining agents, primarily because they there was something unique about them as black people. This uniqueness determined their relation with others and defined their obligation to the race. If a black individual failed to connect with this inner something and with those similarly situated, she would fail, in effect, to live the life that is uniquely hers. Uncle Tom, sellout, race traitor, right? The same goes for African Americans in general. If black people in the United States fail to embrace their cultural inheritance, their unique form of life, then they would fail to live in a way that is truly theirs. The task then is to discover, under the rubble left in the wake of white supremacy, who we are and give voice to an authentic politics in which blackness is the controlling metaphor. Now, we can talk about this, trace this all the way back to Martin Delany and others in the 19th century. So let's call this the archaeological approach. Here, black identity is about discovery, an archaeological project in which we uncover our true selves and infer from that discovery what we must do. Black identity is interpreted here in terms of reality and appearance. There's a real way of being black and a false way, hence keeping it real, Oreo. What's the new ones these days? I don't know. Y'all don't use those words at Wheaton. Okay. Right. There's a real way of being black and a false way. Something out there is essentially black. And when we lose our way on this archaeological approach, as some of us have as a result of white supremacy, we need only find it and all will be well. Now, I should not be too glib. The impulse for this approach has its roots in the devastating effects of white supremacy. Frantz Fanon, writing in the context of colonial struggles, located the reasons for this approach in the passionate research directed by the secret hope, quote, of discovering beyond the misery of today, beyond self-contempt, resignation, and abjuration, some very splendid and beautiful era whose existence rehabilitates us, both in regards to ourselves and others, end quote. The psychological need for archaeological projects that reconstruct monumental histories, then, is part of an effort to respond to collective humiliation. It is a lashing back and a refusal to accept certain conditions of living. It so happens that the conception of the self informing these projects is often fixed and unchanging as a reference for deliberation. With this in mind, it is not really possible to have genuine conflict or uncertainty about how one should act as a black person. The distinction is made beforehand. Either one acts like a true black person, one who understands who she is, or one doesn't. The conflict is only apparent. The problem arises, of course, when individuals or groups postulate one single factor, the racial self, as an explanation of the moral lives of black people. The moral complexity and uncertainty that's often a part of political decision-making in particular is reduced to a simple conflict between showing fidelity to one's cultural inheritance or not. Such a way of rendering complex moral situations in which race is actually involved only indicates the loss of the capacity of discrimination, of an ability to make delicate distinctions. Under such conditions, no matter what the problems may involve, they may involve issues of gender, they may involve issues of class, sexuality, religious preference, geographical difference, or simply the difficulties of falling in and out of love. All problematic situations can be resolved by an appeal to the good and to note the notions of obligation that flow from being authentically black in the world. The moral choices of African Americans are narrowed in such a way that the actual uncertainty and conflict that is characteristic of any situation properly called moral is obscured. The fact that we are often ignorant of the end and of good consequences, of the right and just approach, of the direction of virtuous conduct when we address the complicated issues of race and racism in this country is lost. Moreover, our individuality is compromised as this idea of black identity goes imperial, as Kwame Anthony Appiah, my colleague, rightly worries, and implicates itself in cases where judgments and choices have been made. Judgment and choices have to be made in light of the particular forces that impinge upon us at the time.